We've talked a little bit about commodities as a factor that can affect the environment in which civil war takes place. I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about what we might call lootable resources, and there's been a lot of research in political science over the past 2 decades on how lootable resources influence civil wars, and I'm going to do my best to try to pull this together and integrate some of what we think we've learned. And I'll start with I guess maybe a typology. This is something that's offered by Ross in one of the readings that's assigned for this week. And Ross is asking that question that we kind of previewed a little bit when we talked about oil, about why do some resources contribute to conflict and others don't, and why is that? And he thinks about them in terms of whether the resource sort of innately is lootable or unlootable, right? Is it something that you can basically pick up and walk off with, lootable, versus something that there's no real practical way for that to happen, right? So if something is buried deep underground and requires, tremendous mining equipment to be able to get at, right? Whether it's a deep shaft mine or whether we're talking about, drilling platforms out offshore, that kind of infrastructure makes something unlootable. But then there's also the possibility that the government might obstruct that process of looting. And so it could be that something's just there's no way to get out, in which case they're not going to contribute to wars, or I guess by definition they're not really lootable. But things like timber, we saw timber being used in Cambodia to help fuel rebel groups, requires sort of clear cutting trees and loading them on trucks, and you have to sort of ship those trucks out by road, and it's hard to take those trucks across non-paved spaces, and so it's possible for the government to sort of observe that and control that and prevent timber from being moved out, right? So we could call that moderately obstructable, and those are going to be less likely to fuel civil wars. It's that category of things that are lootable and are really almost impossible to prevent from being exported out. So coca for cocaine, or opium for heroin, alluvial gems, alluvial being sort of found in riverbeds versus gems that are deep underground. Those kind of things that are small, easily transported, high value, maybe it can be easily fed into underground criminal networks, are going to be really hard for states to control, and therefore those are going to be the kind of resources that should cause conflict or should contribute to conflict, or will be, I guess, scooped up into conflict. Okay, so that's one typology, and that's Ross's typology. A second typology I guess we'll talk about is one put forward by Paul Lootable. I find this one really interesting, and in fact I think I may build a question for this course around this typology. I'm still debating. But Lootable's sort of premise is that we should be thinking about resources as something that will help benefit either rebels or governments or different factions, that resources can be distinguished in terms of how they are extracted, whether it's point extraction or diffuse. So point extraction would be like a diamond mine, right? You could find the mine, it's at a spot on a map, there's one entrance, there's one exit, you control that entrance or exit and you control the diamond mine, versus wheat fields, right? A region that is producing a lot of wheat isn't a region that can be controlled from a single point. It's a region that's spread out, and that production of that resource and that wealth requires a lot of space and a lot of land. So it's diffuse in terms of its production. The other thing that we could think about is the geography, right? Whether that resource is being produced in a place that is proximate to the center of the state, the core of the state, the capital, basically, or whether it's happening on the periphery, whether it's distant. And Lootable thinks that the different types of violence that we see might be related to this combination. So he creates sort of this 2x2 table. I'm not sure I'm convinced it works perfectly, but there are sort of, I think, prominent cases where this might hold. And so he thinks that if you have point extraction that's close to the capital, that's proximate, that you're going to have basically palace intrigue as people struggle to control the capital, and you'll see coups d'etats. By contrast, if you have point extraction that's distant, there's no real reason to seize the capital to get control of that resource. If you want control of that resource, you simply need to deny the state access to that point. And so Lootable thinks that secession is more likely to be the case in this kind of conflict. And so maybe that works for the South Sudan long-running civil war, where there was oil based in the south, and that was a point of conflict that had to be resolved and maybe contributed to the idea of secession. We can think about diffuse resources as being proximate, in which case you're sort of in the shadow of state power. The state is going to be able to assert authority over that diffuse resource, but it's going to be difficult to control. And so we might see insurgency or rebellion or guerrilla warfare in that kind of a situation. Whereas if you have a resource that's diffuse but distant, you may see warlordism, where the state isn't necessarily able to project power to control that resource, but local authorities are, and they're going to try to control the territory around that and benefit from it. So maybe this is a useful typology. I'm not entirely convinced it's 100% right, but I think it's provocative, and I think it's maybe a little bit intuitive, and it's something that we could maybe play around with. Okay, so I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk about different types of lootable resources that play a prominent role. And so we'll talk about drugs. And one of the things that we find is that drug production tends to increase Civil War duration. They last longer. Although I should say only opium and cocaine, marijuana doesn't seem to have that effect. And what that suggests to me, particularly when you combine that with the fact that the availability of drug production doesn't seem to increase the likelihood of civil war, is that people aren't getting involved in civil war so that they can get involved in the drug trade. If you want to be involved in the drug trade, you can just do that. But once the civil war starts, it gets the drug trade will get co-opted by the rebel groups that are sort of operating in that area. They'll try to benefit from that. And then once they've sort of tied themselves to that, it becomes difficult to stop, because one of the things that's likely to happen when you set your guns down, when you negotiate, when the conflict ends, is that the ability to continue participating in the drug trade and benefiting from the drug trade is going to go away, unless you happen to be in one of those rare states that tends to actually overtly support and encourage the drug trade. 9 times out of 10, rebel groups are going to be forced to sort of make that break, and that could be economically painful, and that may create incentives for them to stay engaged in the fight over the long term, extending the conflict. Gemstones don't seem to have that effect in the same way. They do have a different effect, I guess. They do increase the likelihood of civil war. So if there are alluvial diamonds in that river, there's a good chance that somebody's going to say, I'm going to use those as a resource to launch this civil war. Whether it's because I don't buy the property rights that aren't being properly exploited in order to get those diamonds out, or just because I have other grievances, and this is my window of opportunity that works really well to sort of fuel that forward. But they don't, and gemstones also seem to increase the duration of civil war, right? And again, I think this fits with the idea of, if the civil war stops, whoever has the property rights for those diamond mines or those diamonds in the riverbeds is going to assert those property rights, and you're going to lose access to this incredibly valuable resource. But again, it's only alluvial diamonds. Diamond mines that are deep underground aren't affected by this, and so it's again feeds back into this idea that rebel groups may be functioning not just in terms of their grievances, but there may also be a greed motivation that keeps these conflicts running over the long term. And then lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about resources as a pressure point that the international community can use to push rebel groups maybe toward the table or to change their behavior. When groups are resource dependent, they may be vulnerable to international pressure. My dissertation kind of looked at this question. I was interested in diplomatic pressure pushing rebel groups to the bargaining table. And what I found is that U.S. diplomatic pressure put on groups that relied upon gemstones seemed to be very effective, much more effective than diplomatic pressure put on groups that didn't have a lootable resource that they relied upon. And I think part of that is that the international community has a way of rallying and controlling the extraction of gemstones, of controlling the global diamond or gemstone market to ensure that blood diamonds or conflict related loot doesn't make its way into the global supply chain around gems. And so there's active ways that can be crushed and could be very detrimental to a group. And so they're likely to respond to that kind of pressure. By contrast, I found that diplomatic pressure put on groups that were relying upon the drug trade had no effect whatsoever, which, after I thought about it, made a lot of sense, because the international community has been trying to stomp out the drug trade for a long time. And that hasn't had a whole huge effect. By definition, the black markets are able to operate beyond state control. And so if a rebel group has already tapped into that, they don't need to worry that the state's going to try to stop them. The state's already trying to stop them. So there seems to be some evidence that these resources may be able to function as a pressure point. We also see the international community sort of using targeted sanctions against groups to try to limit travel or to freeze bank accounts or to possibly make it difficult for groups to benefit from lootable resources. And then probably the most prominent example would be the Kimberley process, in which various different multinational companies involved in the gem trade came together and came up with a structure to track and monitor where gems were coming from, so that they could confidently say these are not being trafficked through conflict zones or trafficked out of conflict zones. They're not fueling insurgencies or rebellions against the state or brutality against civilians. So again, the resources are important, not just from the perspective of how do we explain these conflicts. They're also important because understanding how groups finance themselves, understanding the resources that they rely upon, maybe gives us clues for what we collectively as the international community can do to try to prevent some of the worst atrocities and conflicts, and maybe even push groups to the bargaining table to get conflicts resolved in a timely manner.